Okay, so today we're going to practice how to write a linear equation from a graph. So we're going to be given a graph and we're going to write an equation in slope-intercept form like we practiced last week. So go ahead and start a new page in your notebook, give it a title, Writing a Linear Equation from a Graph. Our first step is going to be looking at the graph and finding the y-intercept. Remember last week we talked about the y-intercept is where does the line pass through the y-axis. So looking at our graph, where would that line go through the y-axis? And remember the y-axis is our vertical line. It goes up and down. Don't forget when we're finding the y-intercept that we want to make sure we're identifying whether it's positive or negative, because that's going to change how we write our equation. If it's positive, we're going to end up putting a plus sign in our equation. If it's negative, we're going to end up subtracting as part of our equation. So remember when you're finding the y-intercept to include that information as well. Is it positive or negative? There will be some times where you will find a y-intercept that is neither positive or negative. It goes right through 0, 0, which we call the origin, and we'll talk about what to do in those situations as well. The second thing we're going to do after we find the y-intercept is count the slope. Again, when we count our slope, we're going to pay attention to whether or not our slope is positive or our slope is negative. Remember, we write slope as rise over run. So we're going to do the vertical change, or up and down over run, left and right. And our slope is usually in fraction form. We may write it into a whole number later when we put it into our equation, but it's going to start always in fraction form because it's going to have rise over run. After we find all of those pieces of information, both the y-intercept and the slope, all we have to do is put it into our slope-intercept form, which is the form that we worked with last week. It looks like this: y equals mx plus b. So remember, we're always going to have y as part of our equation. The m is going to be the slope that we were counting up here. X is always going to be part of our equation. And then plus b is going to be our y-intercept. So it's going to be that point in which we found the line passed through the y-axis. And remember, this plus b might change to a minus b if our y-intercept is negative. So let's do a few examples down here. We're going to look at our first graph on the left, and we're going to follow the steps that we just talked about. So the first thing we're going to do, it says up above, is find our y-intercept. Where does our line pass through our y-axis? So if we look at this line, our y-axis is our vertical line down the center, and we can see that there's a point where our line passes through the y-axis. So I'm going to circle it so I don't forget. And that point is at positive 8. So below my graph, I'm going to write that my y-intercept, and I'm going to include that it's positive so I don't forget when I have to plug it into my equation. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is count the slope of my line. Remember, anytime we're counting slope, we start at the bottom point, and we're going to do our rise over our run. So I could use this point or this point to count my slope. It doesn't matter. I'm going to go ahead and use this point since I already have this point as part of my equation. And I'm going to go up 1, 2, 3, 4. So my rise is 4. And then I'm going to go to the left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So my run is 5. But since I went to the left, remember it's going to be a negative 5. I went up, which is a positive direction, 4. And then I went to the left, which is a negative direction, 5. So my slope is negative 4/5 because one of my numbers here is negative. Now my third step is just to put these two pieces of information into slope-intercept form. So y equals mx plus b. My equation's always going to start with y equals, m represents my slope. So here's my slope, negative 4/5. X always stays part of my equation. So negative 4/5 times x plus b. B is my y-intercept, and I said it was a positive 8, so I'm going to put plus 8. And there is the equation that represents this line. Okay, let's do the second one. The second one, we're going to start up again here with our first step. Find the y-intercept. So where does my line pass through the y-axis? Remember to decide if it's positive or negative. So here I can see clearly that my line passes through at a positive 2. It passes through this y-axis at a positive 2. So my y-intercept is positive 2. Now I'm going to count my slope. Remember, you can use any 2 points along the line to count your slope. But you're going to start at one that's lower than the other and then count rise over run. So I'm going to use this point and this point. I'm going to start here and I'm going to count my rise. 1, 2. So I went up 2. Go ahead and write slope. So I rose 2, so that's a positive 2. And then I'm going to go to the right, 1, 2, 3. Going to the right is also a positive direction, so my denominator is a positive 3. So I have my y-intercept as positive 2 and my slope as positive 2 over 3. So plugging that into my equation, y equals mx plus b. Y equals, m is my slope. I said my slope was a positive 2/3. That's always our coefficient of x. It always goes in front of the x. Plus, because I have a positive y-intercept, 2. So the equation that goes with this graph is y equals 2/3 x plus